Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We've got this stack of your sources here, and we're diving into something that feels, well, both ancient and kind of surprisingly relevant. The doctrine of signatures.
Right.
It's basically this old way humanity trying to read nature like a book, looking for clues for healing that were supposedly written right there in the plants, the rocks, even animals.
Yeah.
So our mission today, yours and ours, is to unpack these sources and really get a handle on this, well, frankly, cool historical way of seeing the world. It's this blend of philosophy, medicine, and, yeah, you have to say, a good dose of intuition.
And what really jumps out from these sources is just how deep this idea went. This wasn't some, quirky side belief.
Ugh.
No, it was a really complex, pretty pervasive system that honestly profoundly shaped how people thought in the early modern period.
Yeah.
Even in a strange way, kind of set the stage for the scientific thinking that would eventually push it aside. You can't really grasp that scientific shift without understanding how central this layered symbolic worldview once was.
Okay, right, let's unpack that then. So at its absolute core, what is the doctrine of signatures? It sounds like they genuinely believed nature was, like, talking to us.
That's pretty much it, yeah. The fundamental idea was that plants, minerals, you name it, had these visible resemblances, the signatures to parts of the human body or diseases or even bodily functions.
Okay.
And crucially, these weren't seen as just random coincidences, Anna. They were understood as deliberate signs.
Deliberate. From who?
From the creator, put there specifically to reveal the hidden medicinal uses, the virtues of that thing. The outer form was basically a key to its inner purpose, its power. Nature was, showing its hand.
Wow. So the world wasn't just stuff, just inert objects sitting around.
No, not at all. Far from it. This whole view really stemmed from a much older idea that the universe is a living, interconnected whole.
Right.
And at the heart of that was the macrocosm-microcosm analogy.
Ah, okay, I've heard of this.
Yeah. The grand universe, the macrocosm, was believed to perfectly mirror the human body, the microcosm.
So everything connected.
Everything. And celestial bodies, the sun, moon, planets, they weren't just distant lights. They were active forces influencing things on Earth. The sun linked to the heart, the moon to bodily fluids and cycles, Jupiter to the liver, Saturn to the spleen. They literally impressed their qualities onto earthly things, and those impressions, those signatures, could be read.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. It sounds like this plugs right into some really deep ancient philosophies about how the universe actually works.
It absolutely does. You can trace these roots way, way back.
Like where?
Well, think about Platonism, the idea of perfect forms existing elsewhere and earthly things being just, imperfect reflections. That sets up the idea of a connection between the ideal and the real.
Okay.
Then Neoplatonism took it further. It described the universe sort of emanating out from this single divine source, the one, and being animated by a world soul, the anima mundi.
A world soul.
Yeah. So if everything came from the one and shared this soul, then everything was fundamentally connected, deeply linked. And those links could become visible. And then you've got Hermeticism with that famous line, as above, so below.
Right.
That hammered home the idea that the macrocosm, the heavens, was directly reflected in the microcosm, us, and Earth. So it became logical, expected even, to look for those celestial patterns reflected down here in nature. These philosophies, they really lay the groundwork for seeing the world as this place full of hidden connections revealed through visible forms.
And then fast forward to the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Certain thinkers really grabbed onto this and brought it back into the spotlight.
Precisely. Marsilio Ficino, for example, was hugely important. He revived Neoplatonic and Hermetic texts.
Okay.
And he really emphasized something called the spiritus mundi. Think of it as a kind of universal spirit, or maybe a medium, that allowed sympathies between things. It explained how celestial forces could influence earthly objects, how those signatures could actually work. It was the transmission mechanism.
Okay. The how.
Exactly. Then you had Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He brought in Christian Kabbalah, looking for divine signatures and numbers and language patterns. That kind of opened the door to seeing any pattern or form in nature as potentially meaningful.
Right, broadening the idea.
And Giovanni Battista della Porta, in his work on natural magic, showed how you could actually use these sympathies, often guided by signatures, put it all together, and they gave real philosophical weight to this concept of nature as a book of nature, a sacred text you could read if you knew the language of its forms.
It really feels like this wasn't just early science, was it? It was this incredible blend of philosophy, religion, and something else too, esoteric stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It was deeply tangled up with what we'd call esoteric currents. Christian Kabbalah, like I mentioned, fostered this mindset of looking for hidden symbolic meanings everywhere in scripture, language, and definitely in nature's forms, seeing them as divine codes.
Okay.
And alchemy played a role too. Yes, it was about transforming matter, lead into gold and all that, but it also relied heavily on the doctrine of affinities.
Affinities.
Yeah, the idea that certain substances were drawn to each other, they sort of liked each other. Alchemists used incredibly complex symbolism, which they saw as signatures of a material's inner spirit, its potential. So these traditions, they provided these different but related frameworks for seeing the world as active, symbolic, full of hidden connections that were revealed through outward forms.
So this whole sophisticated idea, it didn't just spring up fully formed in the Renaissance then? It had much older roots, you were saying.
Much older, yes. You
Wow.
find what you could call proto-signatures, these earlier, maybe more intuitive links, even back in antiquity.
Like with the Greeks and Romans.
Exactly. Thinkers like Dioscorides and Galen, the great medical writers, they observed plants closely. They noted connections between, say, where a plant grew marshy ground, maybe, and its effect on bodily fluids. Or they linked its appearance to its use, though maybe not always strictly based on physical shape like later proponents.
Oh.
Egyptian symbolism, too, associated plants with gods or healing based on appearance or characteristics. And you see similar kinds of thinking, similar underlying inclinations in other traditions.
Like in the East.
Yes, though we have to be careful here, really careful not to oversimplify or just equate things directly.
Right.
But in traditions like traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, you see complex systems linking qualities, color, taste, how a plant grows to energetic properties and correspondences within the body. It's a different framework, but that core idea of reading nature's qualities is there.
And indigenous knowledge.
Absolutely. Indigenous traditions all over the world relied and still rely heavily on observing a plant or animal's appearance, its habitat, its behavior, as crucial clues to its medicinal or spiritual uses. That fundamental human impulse, to find meaning and guidance in nature's patterns seems pretty universal.
So how did these ideas manage to carry on through the Middle Ages, before that big Renaissance revival we talked about?
Well, they persisted through a few key channels. You had the monastic herbals.
The monks copying things?
Exactly. Painstakingly copying texts from figures like Dioscorides and Galen. They preserved that ancient knowledge and often kept those traditional links between plant features and uses alive in the margins, as it were.
Okay.
Then Islamic scholars were absolutely crucial during Europe's so-called Dark Ages. They preserved, translated, and actually expanded on Greek and Roman medical and botanical knowledge. They kept that whole idea of cosmic connections and correspondences in medicine alive, and later this knowledge flowed back into Europe.
Hugely important then.
Massively. And maybe most critically, you had folk medicine. This was the unwritten tradition, passed down orally, generation to generation within communities, often based on raw intuition, trial and error, and those observed resemblances. It kept the core idea of reading nature's clues alive on a practical, everyday level, even when the fancy philosophy wasn't being discussed.
Right, the lived experience.
Yeah.
Then came that Renaissance explosion, as you called it. Who were the really big names who took these ideas and formalized them, gave them serious intellectual weight?
Two figures really stand out.
Yeah.
Jakob Böhme, a German mystic.
Uma.
Yes. He wrote De Signature Rerum, on the signature of things. He gave the doctrine this profound spiritual and theological depth. For Böhme, the outer form wasn't just a hint. It was a direct, God-given expression of the thing's inner spiritual reality. Nature was literally God's signature written on creation.
Wow, it's deep.
It is. And then you had Paracelsus, a hugely influential, sometimes pretty controversial, physician and alchemist.
I've definitely heard of him.
Right. He integrated the doctrine right into a system of medicine and philosophy. Now, he was also trying to isolate active principles chemically. He called them the archeus, the innate spirit, and the arcana, the hidden virtues. But he often used the visible signatures as his guide for where to look for those hidden powers.
So the signature pointed the way.
Exactly. His use of the red oil from St. John's wort for blood issues is a classic case. The plant bleeds red, so it must be good for blood. He really believed that everything outwardly signified its inward nature.
And then the people who actually wrote the big herbals, the plant books, they were key in spreading this.
Absolutely essential for making it widespread and practical. Figures like John Gerard in England, Leonhard Fuchs in Germany. They created these massive illustrated herbals documenting plants in incredible detail.
Right.
Now, they didn't always frame it in Burma's super spiritual terms, but they systematically included observations and traditional uses that lined up perfectly with signature principles. They'd note, this plant's good for the liver because its leaves look like a liver, that kind of thing.
And the printing press must have been huge here.
Oh, revolutionary. Before printing, a detailed herbal was incredibly rare. Expensive. Only the very wealthy or institutions had them. Printing meant these books could be mass-produced, relatively speaking.
Got it.
They became accessible to physicians, apothecaries, even educated households. And that had a massive social impact. It embedded the doctrine of signatures deep into common medical practice all through the 16th and 17th centuries. It wasn't just abstract theory anymore, it was practical knowledge people could hold in their hands.
Okay, so let's get specific. If I'm, say, an apothecary in the 17th century, and I'm looking at a plant, what kinds of signatures am I actually looking for? What did this language look like on the ground?
Right. Well, first off, it wasn't always super simple, like a direct ABB match. Interpretations could be quite layered, bringing in astrology, the theory of humors, affinities between substances.
Okay, so complex.
But yes, many signatures were based on pretty straightforward visual resemblances, what we'd call morphological signatures, basically. Shape.
Like what? Give us some classic examples.
Okay. Heartsease, that little viola flower. Its shape can resemble a heart. So, signature says, good for the heart, maybe physically, but also for emotional troubles, easing the heart.
Okay, makes sense.
Kidney bean looks remarkably like a human kidney, right?
It really does.
So, logically, it was thought to be good for kidney and bladder problems. Same idea with a liverwort, a small plant with these lobed leaves that look a bit like a liver, used for liver issues.
Right.
Lungwort. This one has leaves with white spots, which are seen as resembling diseased lung tissue.
Ah, like tuberculosis spots.
Perhaps, yeah. So signature clear, use it for lung ailments. Eye bright, a little flower, euphrasia often has patterns on it that look like a tiny eye, used for eye problems.
And the walnut. That one's amazing.
The walnut is the classic, isn't it? Juglans regia, crack it open, and that kernel looks uncannily like a miniature human brain. Folds and all.
It really does.
So textbook signature, good for anything related to the head or the brain, headaches, mental clarity, things like that.
Oh, okay. That's shape. What about color or even texture? Do those count as signatures too?
Oh, absolutely. Color or chromatic signatures were incredibly important, often linked directly to the humoral system, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile.
Right, the four humors.
Exactly. So red was obviously linked to blood and the sanguine humor. Plants with red sap, like bloodroot, or just red plants like beetroot, were used for anything involving blood-stopping bleeding, healing wounds, maybe even enriching the blood.
Okay.
Yellow or orange connected to yellow bile and the choleric humor. Suggested uses for jaundice, liver problems, anything seen as an excess of bile. Think of celandine, which has bright yellow sap, or the common dandelion.
Makes sense.
White was associated with phlegm, sometimes bones, or just cool conditions. Milk thistle has that milky sap and white veins on its leaves, maybe suggesting flow, like bile flow, or connected to milk production. Comfrey has a pale root, used famously for knitting bones. Its nickname was literally knit bone.
Knit bone, right.
Dark or black colors were tied to black bile and melancholy, so you might use something like black hellebore for conditions associated with that humor.
And texture. Did that play a role?
It did. Textural signatures mattered. A rough, segmented stem like horsetail, or a hard, bony root like comfrey's, might suggest strength, structure useful for bones, teeth, maybe hair. Something porous or spotted, like the lungwort leaf again, might signify damage or maybe issues with flow or blockage.
So this wasn't just about plants then. Did the whole system extend beyond the plant kingdom?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The system aimed to be comprehensive. You had ecological and growth habit signatures. A plant that grew in very wet, marshy areas might be seen as useful for conditions involving excess fluid or dampness in the body.
Right, like attracts like.
Kind of, yeah. Or a plant that grew very straight and upright might be used for posture problems. Minerals definitely had signatures. Gold, being incorruptible and associated with the sun, was considered a signature for the heart, the noblest organ. Lead, heavy, dull, linked to Saturn, was associated with melancholy.
Wow. Even minerals.
Even animals. Eating the heart of a lion for courage, that kind of idea. And as we touched on earlier, the celestial bodies themselves, the sun, moon, planets, were seen as the ultimate signatures, impressing their specific qualities onto everything down here on Earth. It was a truly integrated, interconnected view of the cosmos and health.
It really was a powerful, all-encompassing way of seeing the world for its time. But clearly, it didn't last as the dominant scientific view. What happened? What caused its decline?
Well, basically, a new way of thinking emerged and gained dominance. Science, with a capital S, you might say.
Okay.
And this new approach demanded fundamentally different things. It required verifiable proof, things you could test repeatedly. It needed quantifiable results, things you would measure. And it fostered a deep skepticism towards knowledge based just on analogy, resemblance, or, frankly, intuition. The very foundation of the doctrine was challenged.
Who are the key figures driving this massive shift in thinking?
Well, you have people like Francis Bacon. He really championed empiricism learning through observation and experiment and inductive reasoning in works like his Novum Organum. He argued you had to collect data, test things, not just rely on old texts or symbolic interpretation.
With the old analogies.
Pretty much. And then René Descartes was hugely influential with his mechanistic philosophy. He viewed the body, and ultimately all of nature, as a kind of complex machine made of parts operating according to physical laws. Predictable.
The body is a machine.
Exactly. And together, thinkers like Bacon and Descartes helped establish a whole new epistemology, a fundamental shift in how you were supposed to gain reliable knowledge. This new way of thinking was then solidified, institutionalized, by the formation of formal scientific societies. The Royal Society in London is the famous example.
Right.
These became centers dedicated to observation, experimentation, collecting facts, sharing results, and they explicitly moved away from philosophical speculation and rejected resemblance, that core idea of the doctrine, as a valid pathway to truth.
And I guess new tools and discoveries started revealing a reality that just didn't match what the signatures were suggesting.
Absolutely critical point. The anatomical revolutions were huge. Think of Andreas Vesalius doing incredibly detailed human dissections and publishing his findings in De Humani Corporis Fabrica.
The fabric of the human body.
Right. His work and others showed the actual intricate internal structure of the body often looked nothing like the external shapes of plants or walnuts. That core visual analogy started to break down under scrutiny.
Okay.
Then came microscopy. People like Robert Hooke, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, they opened up this whole invisible world. Suddenly, diseases could be linked to tiny organisms, bacteria, microbes.
Germ theory beginning.
Exactly. The cause of illness started shifting from cosmic influences or imbalances of humors to these unseen agents. Macroscopic signatures seemed less relevant when the action was happening at a microscopic level. And alongside this, you had the birth of modern chemistry and pharmacology. Figures like Robert Boyle started focusing on isolating active principles from plants. They discovered that the healing effect wasn't necessarily in the whole plant or its shape, but in a specific chemical compound within the plant.
Oh, the actual drug.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Like isolating digoxin from foxglove for heart conditions, the power was found in the molecule, not the overall form. That was a game changer.
So in this emerging scientific view, nature transformed from this, living, communicating entity into just complex machinery, stuff to be analyzed.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. It led to what some call the demystification of nature. The universe was increasingly seen as a silent, ordered machine governed by discoverable physical laws, something to be dissected and analyzed, not a divine text filled with symbols to be read poetically. And in that context, the language of signatures started to seem, well, quaint maybe, but scientifically irrelevant.
And societal changes kind of reinforced this shift away from the doctrine.
They definitely did. Medicine itself became more professionalized. You had formal training, standardized exams, official lists of approved drugs, pharmacopoeias. These naturally favored remedies with observable, repeatable effects, not those based on symbolic links.
Right. Standardization.
And the broader intellectual climate of the Enlightenment, with its huge emphasis on reason, clarity, empirical evidence, it just didn't have much room for a system based on analogy and ancient correspondences. The doctrine of signatures increasingly looked like superstition, like pre-scientific thinking. It wasn't just quietly forgotten. It ended up with a legacy of discredit. It was actively dismissed, even ridiculed in later scientific and medical writings.
So basically science invalidated it, called it superstition, and moved on.
Is that the complete end of the story for the doctrine of signatures? Just a historical curiosity?
It's interesting. Scientifically, yes, it was superseded, but is that the end of the story? Not really. There's still this enduring allure to it.
Allure? How so? Well, I think it speaks to a deeper human need. a need for meaning, for purpose, for feeling a connection to the natural world. And sometimes a purely reductionist, mechanistic scientific view, for all its power, can leave that need unfulfilled. The doctrine offered a world imbued with meaning.
Okay, I can see that. So where do we actually see echoes or influences of this kind of thinking today, even if it's subtle?
Well, one clear area is ethnobotany.
Studying traditional plant use.
Exactly. Researchers study how different cultures have used plants for medicine, food, rituals, and very often that traditional knowledge is rooted in rationales that sound a lot like signature's appearance, where it grows, how it behaves.
Right.
And here's the fascinating part. This traditional knowledge, even if based on wrong reasoning like signatures, often provides the crucial starting point for serendipitous discoveries of real pharmacologically active compounds.
You mean the signature pointed them in the right direction, even if for the wrong reason?
Sometimes, yes. Think about St. John's wort again. Traditionally used for melancholy, maybe linked to its sunny yellow flowers or the blood spots on its leaves. Now we know it contains compounds effective for mild depression. Willow bark, chewed for pain for centuries, led to aspirin. Foxglove, linked to the heart by some traditions, gave us digoxin.
Wow.
So while the doctrine wasn't scientifically valid, the observations it encouraged sometimes acted as a useful heuristic, a practical way to remember and pass down knowledge about which plants did something. There's a real kind of pharmaceutical debt, you could say, to these older ways of observing nature.
That's a really interesting way to put it, pharmaceutical debt. What about outside of medicine? Are there echoes elsewhere?
I think so. Look at biomimicry.
Copying nature's designs.
Exactly. It's a modern scientific and engineering discipline, but what does it do? It looks closely at nature's forms, processes, and systems for inspiration to solve human problems, studying lotus leaves for self-cleaning surfaces, gecko feet for adhesives, termite mounds for passive cooling.
Right. Amazing stuff.
It shares that fundamental spirit of looking at nature's form and asking, what wisdom is embedded here? What can this teach us? It's almost like the doctrine's core impulse, reading nature's design, found a new, scientifically respectable application, shifting from healing the body to engineering solutions.
That's a great connection.
Sure.
And what about the power of belief itself, the placebo effect? Did the doctrine play a role there?
Almost certainly. The doctrine provided a really powerful, deeply meaningful narrative for why a particular remedy should work. If you genuinely believe that God designed this liver-shaped leaf to heal your liver, that creates a very strong expectation of healing.
Right. It makes sense within that worldview.
Exactly, and we know that patient expectation and belief, the placebo effect, can have real physiological effects. The compelling meaning the doctrine ascribed to remedies could absolutely have fueled that effect, showing how important the psychological and narrative framework can be in the healing process, separate from any direct chemical action.
And you see hints of this desire for meaning in some modern movements too, right? People looking for more natural or holistic approaches.
Yes, I think many New Age and holistic movements tap into some of the same currents. They often emphasize natural healing, a view of the person as a whole system, and seek a spiritual or energetic connection to nature. Now, they're obviously distinct from the historical doctrine, often blending various ideas, but they reflect that persistent human longing for the kind of integrated understanding, that sense of participation and connection with nature, that the doctrine of signatures, in its own way, offered.
And finally, it just feels like this way of thinking, reading symbols in nature, is still kind of baked into our culture, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. The human mind just seems wired for symbolism. Think about how we still use nature as symbol constantly. The oak tree for strength, the dove for peace, the rose for love. These associations are deep and enduring.
Yeah, second nature.
We use common idioms that echo this old way of thinking without even realizing it. Calling certain foods brain food, or saying someone is seeing red when angry, or having a heart of stone. These link physical things or colors to qualities or emotions.
I never thought of brain food that way.
And it's everywhere in our art, literature, folklore, and even popular culture. Fantasy genres are often steeped in nature symbolism. That language of symbols, that impulse to find meaning reflected in the forms and patterns of the natural world, it really hasn't gone away. It remains very much alive. So when you step back, we've traced this really incredible journey, haven't we? From this intricate, comprehensive system rooted in a living cosmos and divine intention, through its profound challenge and eventual invalidation by science, and finally uncovering these subtle yet persistent echoes in how we still think, discover, and find meaning today.
And I think for you, the listener, the real takeaway here isn't just the fascinating history. The doctrine of signatures, even though science ultimately moved past its framework, serves as this powerful lens for epistemological history. It dramatically shows us how our very rules for what counts as reliable knowledge have changed over time.
That's a great point.
And maybe more profoundly, it highlights that fundamental, enduring human need for meaning, that desire to see purpose and connection in the world around us. Something that maybe purely reductionist science, for all its strengths, sometimes struggles to address directly.
Which leaves us and you with a final, maybe provocative thought to chew on. Can science and symbolism, these two powerful, often seemingly opposed ways of understanding the world, actually coexist? What unique value does each perspective offer? And maybe more importantly, what do we risk losing if we decide we can only embrace one? Perhaps the path towards a richer, fuller understanding involves finding ways to integrate both the rigorous, analytical power of science and that deep, undeniable human need for meaning, connection, and the symbolic resonance we find in nature.